All right, hey everybody, we are back with our. Sorry about that. I forgot to close my door to keep the riffraff out. All right, so last part of Unit 4 is part 2 of domestic and social policymaking. And then there will be a quiz and test then next week as well. So here we go. Hopefully, get it done in one shot here. We don't have to do two parts. All right, so we did the social policy part and the welfare issues and social security and things like that. Now we're going to talk about business regulation. We'll talk about some environmental policy stuff. All right, so start with business. It starts with antitrust laws. That is majoritarian politics, as we've talked a little bit about here and there. If you might remember back from U.S. history, that late 1800s is when this sort of really started. Um, and the antitrust laws generally don't pit one group or interest in society against another. We're going to contrast that a little bit later with how some areas do, some of these policy issues do. So it starts with the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. So all of this, what we're dealing with here is the Federal Trade Commission created in 1914. Some more antitrust stuff also in 1914. All of these generally have to do, at least the antitrust stuff, have to do with monopolies and making sure monopolies can't happen, because monopolies are not free market. Monopolies are anti-free market. Regulation to keep monopolies at bay is a good thing for a free market. All right. Energetic business regulation policy is usually based on ideology, though. For instance, but there's a bit of some anomalies here too. So President Reagan ended an antitrust lawsuit against IBM that had carried over from Carter into his first term, and he directed the Justice Department to end that. Yet, however, during the same time period during his administration, AT&T, that says yet broke up AT&T behind my picture there. AT&T was essentially the telephone back in those days, right? The telephone. It was the telephone monopoly. It basically had every bit of business of telephones in the country. So he had the Justice Department work to break that up through lawsuits and things like that. And Clinton, on the liberal side, generally are more energetic, and he brought charges against Microsoft. So that sort of follows a little bit into the liberal side. The conservative side generally is less energetic. Put it that way. All right. So let's talk about labor and occupational health and safety. It's really labor that we're going to be discussing most, and that's unions. So, and this is interest group politics. This definitely pits, like last slide said, does not pit one group against another. These do. Okay, the unions against the businesses. Those are both very powerful groups, and they headbutt here because one side gets substantial benefits and one side has substantial costs when things happen. The freer that unions are to operate and be promoted hurts businesses. It puts a substantial cost on businesses. If businesses have more leverage at a time, then it might confer some costs on to the unions. All right, so a couple of pieces of legislation. The Wagner Act in 1935, very pro-union, creates that National Labor Relations Board that has to do. Remember, that had to do with the whole issue with the last summative FRQ that we did. It regulated the conduct of unions, especially in their elections, and fielded complaints about unfair labor practices. This was essentially a very pro-union law. Taft-Hartley Act just after World War II was sort of try to balance that out and become a more pro-business or help businesses. That created things like open shop states, or what we call right-to-work states, where states don't necessarily have to allow unions to dominate every workplace. Some states do. Those are called closed shop states. A bunch of states have open shop, and like Georgia is an open shop, or what they call a right-to-work state. And interestingly enough, these days, and if we don't count COVID, let's just forget that because that affected everybody. But the pro open shop or the pro right to work states generally have had better economies, let's say over the past 10, 15, 20 years, than the closed shop states. Right to work states generally are more open to better business regulation for businesses. However, also a president could step in after this Taft-Hartley Act if strikes were going to be against the national interest. And President Truman did this not too long after the Taft-Hartley Act was passed. He did this during the Korean War, and I think it was coal miners. And he directed and ordered as the president, which seems kind of weird that you can do this, but that law allowed it, that the president could order the coal miners back to work and stop going on strike because it was in the national interest. It was a national security issue because we're fighting a war. All right, Democrats and liberals usually, however, we put it all together, usually much more pro-union, and Republicans are usually much more pro-business. Okay, that's a general way we can put those together. All right, let's take a quick look at agriculture subsidies. This is client politics, benefits one group at the expense of many others, and we're going to talk about dairy farmers. And in the United States today, and for a very, 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 very long time, milk is way more expensive than it should be if it was a free market. That's because the government regulates and subsidizes milk prices, dairy farmers, and the government buys the excess. Way more milk is produced than the country needs, than the market would say, but it keeps more of those dairy farmers in business, so then the government buys the excess. So we are paying more for milk than we should, and then we're spending taxpayer money on the excess. So, but it's a business that has client politics, has interest groups that are powerful enough to get Congress to keep going along. The New England states, especially New York, a very big dairy state. Wisconsin, of course, Michigan, those kind of states have enough clout to be able to make this happen. Because what also happens here, I'm going to get into econ, hopefully you've done it, is what this has created, these subsidies have created a price floor. And I could do the graph for you if you wanted, the supply and demand graph, and you see what price floor does, and you'll see what it does. It artificially raises prices. They are still in place. So they exist. And again, so the idea is milk is much more expensive than it should be if we had an open free market. It just is. So this is just one example of business regulation policy. And it cost taxpayers in 2006 about $4 billion to buy up all that excess dairy. So it's something that's out there. All right, consumer environmental protection. We call this, the course used to use this term. We don't use it anymore, but I leave it in here. It's called entrepreneurial politics. Dramatizing an issue, getting public opinion galvanized, and motivating congressional action. One of the best examples of this was back in the early 1900s. You probably have somewhere in your ELA class along the line somewhere, you've read excerpts from The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. The excerpts that are usually read about the nastiness of the meat packing plant that the guy works in the story, in the book. And that did galvanize congressional action because it galvanized public feeling, public opinion, and the Food and Drug Administration was created and things like that to regulate things like that. They're still around today. Our meat packing plants are regulated, other food areas are regulated, things like that. Ralph Nader was a guy who pioneered himself in auto safety. It was in the 1960s, and I think it was a Ford vehicle that he wrote a book that dramatized it and galvanized public opinion. The book was called Unsafe at Any Speed. It was about whatever the Ford car was. It apparently rolled over easily and stuff like that, and all sorts of stuff. So it's an entrepreneurial tech thing. All right, environmental policy, last couple of slides. Dozens of major environmental laws passed since 1963. There were several major incidents in the 60s leading to the first Earth Day in 1970. It's been around since 1970. One of the things I do always show is, you think Earth Day people, right? It's all about the planet and everything else. But this slide over here, I always show it. This was after an Earth Day rally in San Francisco in 1 year. I think it was in the 1990s. It might have been the 1980s. I always show it to kind of irony that these people care about the planet, and then they leave the park like that after their gathering to celebrate Earth Day. The Environmental Protection Agency was created in 1970. The Clean Air Act also around that time, and that's been updated through time. The Endangered Species Act fits into this. It passed in 1973. So all of these environmental policies really start being put into place in the 1970s. But the issue is how much it costs, okay? How much is too much? So you get the idea. Say, so you use like our water is 98% clean. Let's just use that figure. So, and we spend a lot of money on making sure our water is 98% clean. Is it worth another $2 trillion to make it 98.5% clean? That's the idea. How much is too much? And that kind of thing would raise the price of water and things like that, probably more than consumers would want it to. So there's trade-offs here. And a lot of that, we talk about global warming, climate change, or whatever the new term is now. I don't know. I can't follow it. It changes every other year. But the idea here is just give you an idea. There is a partisan difference. This was taken in, I think it was 2006. That's just behind my picture there. And you can see the partisan difference between Republicans and Democrats. So it is a partisan style issue. Some proposed regulations are going to severely affect the economy. And that's where, are we going to do the trade-offs or not? For instance, the Kyoto Accords, just before you were born, done in Japan. President Clinton joined it up, said yeah, but he never ever submitted it. It was a treaty. He never submitted it to the Senate for ratification because he knew the Senate would never ratify it. In fact, to punctuate that point, the Senate actually, on its own, basically said, don't bother sending this. They rejected it in what was called a nonpartisan vote, 95 to nothing. That means all of the liberals, too, all of them said 90, because it required the United States to make all the sacrifices, and the rest of the world didn't have to do anything. They could even increase, like the Chinas and the Indias of the world could increase their outputs of the greenhouse gases and everything else. So all it did was penalize the United States. So even all of the liberals in the Senate at that time said no. That leads us to now the Paris Accords, right? Obama added us to it, never submitted it to the Senate. President Trump took us out of it, and now just in the last week, I think, Biden has put it back in and put us back into it. But you will notice he will never submit it to the Senate because, sort of the same way, it requires the developed nations of the Western world, the U.S. and basically the Western Europeans, to make all the sacrifices, and China and India don't have to. So the point is that the U.S. will never agree to it as a treaty. So, maybe it's just window dressing that this happens now. I don't know. All right, so the last bit, then, environmental policy. There are three distinctive features in the United States about environmental policy. One is it's adversarial. There are strict rules. There are deadlines. There's expensive technology that's required to do this. So the businesses have to do it, which means it puts costs onto the consumers. The CO2, the carbon dioxide scrubbers and things like that need to be put on coal plants and stuff are ultra expensive, and if you want to even improve them, it's going to be even more expensive, and people don't want their electricity bills to go up. So that's the adversarial type relationship that there is. And of course, since there's adversarial relationships, there's lawyers around, hundreds and hundreds of lawyers. There's countless lawsuits. If you want to try to build a building, there's going to be a lawsuit slapped on you just to do all of this stuff. If you want to make a major development, somebody's going to slap a lawsuit on you. So the lawyers get to make all sorts of money here. It's state dependent, meaning that the national government sets the rules, but how they achieve the rules is left up to the states. For instance, they set highway rules, so you can expand highways if you want to, and they'll even provide some money along with the state money, but you have to follow some rules. So if states want to expand in their state, some of the things, like Georgia chooses to add HOV lanes or HOT lanes or things like that, or you can do other things like do mass transit and stuff like that. So there's ways that the states have choices to do this kind of stuff. And then, of course, there's interest group pressures. Pluralist and hyper-pluralist pressure, big time. Remember back to Unit 1. This is a hyper-pluralist issue. And I think there's one more thing, and the pressures are brought by interest groups on both sides. All right, so we're just about out of time. It's perfect. We have ended Unit 4. You have a quiz to do in this time period that will end on Monday, and then test next week before we get ourselves right into Unit 5. And that's the last unit. So good luck on this. Good luck on the quiz. Good luck on the test, and we'll